The woman in the white hard hat did not even slow down when she reached him. She looked at the dented red toolbox resting beside his boots, then at the little girl standing near his leg with two uneven braids and a backpack almost bigger than her shoulders. The noise inside the factory yard rolled around them in waves. Forklifts beeped, steel doors rattled. Somewhere deep in the building, a warning alarm pulsed every 6 seconds like a slow heartbeat. The woman folded her arms. "You are telling me this is the technician they sent?" Nobody answered her. The operations director kept staring at the concrete. The man beside the toolbox waited. The woman gave a dry laugh and pointed toward the loading bay where 24 engineers stood around silent conveyor systems. "This plant loses $200,000 an hour when those lines stop moving." She glanced down at the toolbox again. "And they sent a man carrying something that looks like it belongs in his grandfather's garage." The little girl looked up at her father. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. The woman noticed. "This is not daycare," she said. "Whoever you are, you need to leave your kid outside the facility." The father finally spoke. "She stays where I stay." Calm, flat, barely above the sound of machinery. The woman's jaw moved once. Then she stepped closer. "Listen carefully. We already lost 3 hours because somebody at corporate decided to gamble on an independent contractor instead of a real industrial response team. If you waste 1 more minute of mine, security will escort both of you back through that gate." The little girl looked past them toward the factory. Smoke curled from a rooftop exhaust stack. Then 3 black SUVs rolled through the front entrance. Not company vehicles, federal plates. And suddenly every guard at the gate stood straighter. "Before we get into what really happened inside that factory, take a second and tell us where you're watching from tonight." These stories travel farther than people expect, and it is always worth seeing how many corners of the country are listening together at the same time. Subscribe if you believe quiet people deserve to have their stories told too. What happened in that building did not start with a broken machine. It started years earlier with a man who learned how to survive by fixing things nobody else wanted to touch. Calvin Reed lived in a narrow brick duplex on the west side of Dayton, Ohio, where the porches leaned slightly forward like tired shoulders, and every winter left another crack somewhere in the sidewalk. The house had 1 bathroom, old radiator heat, and kitchen cabinets that closed only if you lifted them slightly before pushing. His daughter Naomi knew exactly which cabinet needed the extra lift. She had known since she was 6. Every morning started the same way. Coffee first, then the weather report playing softly from the radio balanced beside the sink. Then Naomi walking into the kitchen wearing mismatched socks and asking questions that arrived faster than most adults could answer. Why do buses kneel down at the curb? Why do birds stand on power lines without getting hurt? Why do people trust automatic doors? Calvin answered all of them while packing lunches. He answered carefully, not because he thought every answer mattered, because he knew she was learning whether the world made sense. That mattered. By 7:15, they were usually out the door. Calvin drove an old white service van with faded lettering on the side from a company that no longer existed. He had bought it at auction after the previous owner folded during the recession. Most people would have replaced the decals. Calvin never bothered. The van still carried scratches from ladders and loading docks and years of weather. Inside, though, everything had a place. Wrenches arranged by size, voltage meters wrapped carefully in cloth, spare relays stored in labeled bins. 3 flashlights, 2 emergency blankets, a photograph taped above the dashboard. Naomi at age 4 sitting on his shoulders during a county fair fireworks show. Her mother had taken the picture 6 months before the cancer spread into places the doctors stopped describing directly. Calvin rarely spoke about his wife, not because he avoided her memory, because he carried it everywhere already. Some evenings, Naomi would ask what her mother sounded like. Calvin always answered the same way, like somebody who never rushed a sentence. That answer seemed enough for her. After Monica died, people kept trying to help in ways that sounded useful from a distance. Church ladies delivered casseroles, co-workers sent grocery cards, neighbors offered advice about raising daughters. Most of it disappeared after 6 months. Grief made people uncomfortable once it lasted longer than expected, but the bills kept arriving with perfect consistency. Hospital bills, insurance disputes, car repairs, school expenses. Calvin started taking overnight repair calls across 3 counties, food processing plants, packaging facilities, water treatment systems. Most industrial electricians specialized in one type of machinery. Calvin became valuable because he understood systems other people avoided. Older systems, Frankenstein systems, machines that had been modified so many times nobody remembered what the original wiring looked like anymore. He liked tracing problems backward. A failed conveyor usually started somewhere far from the conveyor itself. People missed that. They replaced visible parts instead of understanding movement. Calvin understood movement. He could walk into a noisy building and tell when a bearing was about to fail just from rhythm. He could smell overheated insulation before alarms triggered. Managers learned to trust him reluctantly at first, then completely. But independent contractors lived differently from salaried engineers. No retirement package. No paid leave, no safety net. If Calvin stopped working, income stopped too. So Naomi grew up inside waiting rooms and maintenance offices and empty cafeterias during overnight shifts. She learned how to sleep across 3 chairs pushed together. She learned which vending machines jammed and which security guards carried peppermints. She carried colored pencils everywhere. Most nights, she drew machines, not cartoon machines, real ones, conveyor belts, hydraulic presses, cooling towers. Sometimes Calvin would glance over during work and see her sketching the exact equipment he was repairing. The details always startled him. One winter night, during a repair call at a bottling facility outside Columbus, Naomi sat cross-legged near a maintenance cage while Calvin replaced damaged motor starters. A supervisor walked by and laughed softly. "Your daughter actually likes being here." Calvin tightened a bolt before answering. "She likes watching things come back to life?" Naomi looked up. Machines get embarrassed when people yell at them. The supervisor blinked, then laughed harder. Calvin did not. He simply handed Naomi another pencil. There were stretches when money narrowed dangerously. One transmission failure almost ended everything. Calvin spent 2 weeks biking to local jobs while saving for repairs. Naomi rode behind him in a child seat, despite being too old for one. She never complained. One rainy afternoon, they stopped outside a grocery store after his backpack zipper broke. Calvin crouched beside the bike with a multi-tool and fixed it using a spare wire connector. Naomi watched carefully. "Can you fix everything?" He smiled slightly. "No, what can't you fix?" "Something stopped wanting to work." She thought about that all the way home. Years passed. Naomi grew taller. Her questions became sharper. Calvin's hands became rougher. He stopped wearing his wedding ring after catching it against a steel panel during a repair job. The scar remained. Most people who hired him never knew much about him beyond his invoices and completion times. That suited him. He preferred quiet exits, fix the problem, leave. But certain companies remembered him, especially after the Black Ridge packaging disaster. That case traveled quietly through manufacturing circles because nobody wanted the details public. A frozen control system had shut down 3 facilities across 2 states. Corporate consultants blamed sabotage. Union workers blamed management. A cybersecurity team blamed outdated infrastructure. Calvin spent 11 hours inside an overheated server room and discovered the entire collapse started from condensation dripping through a cracked rooftop conduit onto a backup relay panel. $30,000 in repairs instead of $12 million. Afterward, one executive offered him a permanent position. Calvin declined. Why? Because permanent jobs stop people from leaving when they should. The executive never understood what he meant. Naomi did. She heard the stories late at night while washing dishes beside him. She also knew what he never admitted aloud. He stayed independent because hospitals had taught him what corporations did when profit collided with human beings. He trusted work, not institutions. The call from Harlow Biotech arrived on a Thursday afternoon during one of Naomi's school science fairs. Calvin stood beside a folding table covered in her homemade water filtration project when his phone vibrated. He ignored it once, then twice. By the 3rd call, he stepped into the hallway. A strained voice introduced himself as Ethan Pike, operations director at the Harlow Advanced Manufacturing Campus outside Indianapolis. Calvin recognized the company immediately. $500 million facility, automated pharmaceutical production, state contracts, military supply partnerships, clean rooms, precision robotics. The kind of place that usually hired engineering firms large enough to occupy entire office towers. "We got a systems failure spreading across production lines," Pike said. "Nobody can isolate it. We already brought in 2 teams. Call another one." "We did." Calvin leaned against the hallway wall. "Then why are you calling me?" Silence first, then a quieter answer. "Because one of the consultants used to work at Black Ridge." Calvin looked through the cafeteria doors toward Naomi, explaining filtration layers to a teacher. "When do you need me?" "Now." Indianapolis sat nearly 2 hours away. Calvin hesitated. Not because of the drive, because overnight jobs had become harder since Naomi entered middle school. She hid exhaustion better now. Still, he walked back inside. Naomi took one look at his face. "Big problem, probably." "Can I come? You got school tomorrow?" She glanced around the gymnasium. "Nobody here understands activated charcoal except me and you." Calvin almost laughed. Almost. By 6 that evening, they were on Interstate 70 heading west while rain drifted across the windshield in silver bands. Naomi did homework under the dashboard light. Calvin drove with one hand resting lightly near the steering wheel. At a gas station outside Richmond, Indiana, Naomi returned from the restroom holding microwave macaroni and a package of crackers. She climbed into the van. "You think they'll be rude?" Calvin looked at her. "Why would you ask that? Rich companies always act nervous around people who fix things." He turned the key. The engine coughed once before settling. "Maybe they're nervous because broken things tell the truth. Harlow Biotech rose from the industrial district like a polished airport terminal. Glass walls, floodlights, corporate banners snapping in the wind, security checkpoints every 100 yards. The parking lots alone stretched farther than several city blocks, and at the center of it all stood Veronica Hale, Chief Executive Officer, 48 years old. Former mergers attorney, known for restructuring failing companies with brutal efficiency. Magazine profiles described her as relentless. Former employees used harsher words when reporters were not nearby. Veronica believed deeply in systems, not people. People disappointed. Systems only failed when weak people interfered with them. That belief had carried her through decades of boardrooms dominated by older men who underestimated her until they no longer could. She built herself into somebody impossible to dismiss. Now she expected the same hardness from everyone around her, especially inside Harlow. The factory crisis had already consumed 36 hours. Automated production lines stopped mid-cycle. Backup systems froze. Pressure sensors malfunctioned. Diagnostic software contradicted itself every 20 minutes. Every idle hour threatened government penalties and contract losses. 3 consulting firms had failed to identify the root problem. One team blamed malware. Another blamed voltage irregularities. A third recommended partial demolition of the control network. Veronica trusted none of them anymore. What she trusted was appearance. Competence looked a certain way to her. Tailored suits, large teams, confident language, expensive equipment cases. Then Calvin Reed walked through her gate carrying an old steel toolbox with chipped paint and a sleeping bag rolled beneath one arm because he had driven directly from Ohio, and beside him stood a tired 12-year-old girl with pencil marks on her hands. Veronica saw disorder, risk, liability. She saw another man pretending experience mattered more than scale. Her own father had been a maintenance mechanic in Tulsa. She rarely discussed him. He spent 30 years repairing refinery equipment before dying with arthritic hands and no retirement. Veronica spent her entire adult life running away from that kind of existence. To her, success meant never needing grease under your fingernails again. So when she looked at Calvin, she saw everything she had fought not to become. That sharpened her voice without her realizing it. The engineers surrounding her noticed. Nobody interrupted. Corporate culture trained people carefully. Meanwhile, the factory deteriorated. Cooling systems cycled unpredictably. Sterile manufacturing zones risked contamination. Federal compliance officers already requested emergency reports. And somewhere beneath the surface sat another truth almost nobody inside Harlow understood. 3 months earlier, Calvin had received an unusual request from a former Army logistics analyst named Renee Torres. She worked with a federal procurement oversight unit investigating equipment irregularities among pharmaceutical contractors supplying military medical reserves. Several facilities showed unexplained maintenance gaps and inventory inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic enough for headlines, just patterns, repeated patterns. Torres needed somebody who understood industrial infrastructure deeply enough to notice manipulations hidden inside ordinary repair logs. Calvin had spent years reading systems the way mechanics read engines. He noticed what people ignored. At first he refused. He was not law enforcement. He had a daughter. He had bills. But Torres kept calling. Then she showed him maintenance reports from Harlow. Sensor replacements billed but never installed. Emergency power inspections signed without verification. Safety bypasses added temporarily then left active for months. Not catastrophic corruption. Worse, incremental neglect. The kind that spreads because everyone assumes somebody else checked. Calvin agreed to consult quietly. Only on infrastructure. Only off the record. For 11 weeks he reviewed archived systems remotely between normal repair jobs. He noticed anomalies concentrated around one production cluster. Cluster 7. The exact section now collapsing. Torres warned him federal investigators were preparing formal action. Then the emergency shutdown happened before the investigation finished. Suddenly, Harlow faced both operational disaster and potential criminal exposure. Calvin understood something immediately. If the system failure connected to the manipulated maintenance records, panic inside the facility could destroy evidence before investigators arrived. That was why he said very little after reaching the gate. That was why he tolerated Veronica Hale's dismissal. That was why he did not explain who else might be coming. Inside the factory, Naomi sat quietly near an observation office while Calvin walked production floors with Ethan Pike. He moved slowly, not because he lacked urgency, because rushing hides details. He listened to motors, touched conduit casings, smelled overheated circuitry, asked for temperature logs, then old maintenance reports. Engineers grew impatient. One consultant muttered that the independent contractor was wasting time. Calvin ignored him. At one point, Veronica intercepted them near Control Hub B, Tell me you found something useful. Calvin studied the blinking diagnostic wall. When was the last manual inspection on Cluster 7? We have digital diagnostics for that. That wasn't my question. Her mouth tightened. 8 months. Calvin nodded once. Then he asked another. Who approved bypass routing on the cooling relays? Veronica looked toward Pike. Pike swallowed. Temporary emergency authorization during last winter's expansion. Temporary. Nobody answered. Calvin crouched beside a lower electrical cabinet and removed the panel. Dust-coated sections that should have been serviced recently. A relay connector showed heat scoring, not from sudden failure, from prolonged overload. He stood. Shut down secondary line pressure now. One engineer objected immediately. That could collapse the remaining active systems. Calvin looked at him. Keeping them running will. The room hesitated. Then Veronica made the decision. Do it. 15 minutes later, the factory lights flickered. Somebody cursed. A supervisor sprinted across the corridor. Then silence rolled through the production wing as secondary systems powered down. For the first time all night, the grinding noise underneath the building disappeared. Calvin closed his eyes briefly, listening. Then he walked directly toward sub-level 4. Nobody else had checked there because the automated diagnostics showed normal activity. Calvin trusted sound more than software. Sub-level 4 smelled faintly metallic. Condensation lined several cooling pipes. Near the rear wall sat an unauthorized junction modification hidden behind newer conduit shielding. Calvin stared at it for a long time. Then he asked Pike for a flashlight. The wiring splice was amateur work disguised professionally. Temporary load balancing added to compensate for failing relays. Exactly the kind of shortcut maintenance teams used when executives demanded uninterrupted production. Except the bypass had gradually overloaded core distribution systems until the entire network destabilized. Calvin straightened slowly. Whoever installed this knew it violated compliance standards. Pike looked sick. Can you fix it? Yes. How long? 3 hours if nobody interrupts me. Veronica stepped closer. That's all. Calvin met her eyes for the first time since arriving. 3 hours if your people stop trying to protect themselves and start helping. Something shifted in the corridor after that. Not respect yet. Something quieter. Recognition. Work began immediately. Calvin assigned tasks with calm precision. Manual relay replacements, pressure redistribution, circuit isolation. Naomi sat near a maintenance desk, sketching updated wiring diagrams faster than junior technicians could copy them digitally. One exhausted engineer finally noticed. Did your dad teach you this? She shrugged. I watch. At 2:17 in the morning, the federal SUVs arrived, not FBI, Department of Defense procurement investigators, accompanied by federal infrastructure auditors. Dark jackets, hard cases, minimal conversation. Veronica watched them enter through the security corridor while color slowly drained from her face. Renee Torres stepped inside last. She spotted Calvin immediately across the production floor. You found it. He handed her photographs from the unauthorized bypass. Hidden load rerouting. She studied them silently. Then nodded once. This connects half the discrepancies we've been tracing. Veronica approached. Who exactly are these people? Torres answered without hostility. Federal oversight. For several seconds, the only sound came from cooling fans spinning down overhead. Veronica looked at Calvin. You knew. Calvin tightened a final connector inside the relay housing. I knew the system was telling the truth. That answer landed harder than accusation. The remaining repair work continued under sharp fluorescent light, while investigators separated maintenance supervisors into conference rooms upstairs. Nobody shouted, nobody needed to. At 3:41 in the morning, Calvin restored primary distribution power, one line at a time. Monitors awakened across the facility. Pressure systems stabilized. Conveyors restarted with slow mechanical rhythm. Then the production floor came alive fully for the first time in nearly 2 days. Engineers stared upward as green indicators replaced warning lights, row after row. Somebody exhaled loudly. Another worker actually clapped once before stopping himself. Veronica stood motionless near the control station. Her expensive shoes were streaked with dust from the lower levels. She watched Calvin close his toolbox carefully before wiping his hands with an old cloth. That was the moment from the beginning, the moment where the room changed shape around what it finally understood. Not because he announced himself, because the machines did. Veronica walked toward him slowly. The surrounding staff grew quiet enough to hear the low hum returning through the production floor. You could have told me who you were. Calvin latched the final clasp on his toolbox. You already decided before asking. Nothing in his voice rose. Nothing sharpened. Naomi stood beside him, holding the flashlight she had carried most of the night. She looked between the adults without speaking. Veronica opened her mouth, stopped, then looked down at the child. You stayed here the whole time? Naomi nodded. He likes when somebody remembers where the screws go. A few nearby technicians looked away suddenly. Torres approached, with a thin folder under one arm. Mr. Reed, we'll need formal statements later this week. Calvin nodded. Tomorrow afternoon, school in the morning. Torres glanced at Naomi and smiled faintly. Understood. Then she left him standing there while federal investigators moved deeper into the building. Veronica remained beside the control station long after most employees dispersed. The restarted factory sounded different now. Not triumphant, exposed. By dawn, several senior maintenance administrators had been suspended pending investigation. Internal emails surfaced, deferred inspections, budget pressure, temporary fixes hidden beneath polished reports. Nothing Veronica read made her comfortable, especially her own signatures approving accelerated production schedules. She sat alone inside her office after sunrise, staring at a framed magazine cover showing her beside the headline, "The Woman Rebuilding American Industry." The words suddenly sounded theatrical. Down below, crews cleaned work areas while machines resumed operation. Veronica remembered her father kneeling beside refinery pumps with grease covering his forearms. She used to hate how invisible people treated him. At some point she had learned to admire invisibility from the other direction. Executives rarely saw mechanics unless something failed, then they expected miracles instantly. She pressed her fingers against her temple. Around 8 in the morning, she walked through the now functioning production wing and found Ethan Pike reviewing updated diagnostics. How long had that bypass been active? He answered carefully. 14 months. Did you know? Pike looked exhausted. I knew we kept delaying proper repairs because downtime penalties were brutal. That was not the same as answering. No. Veronica nodded once. Not forgiveness. Not acceptance, only acknowledgement that systems had not failed accidentally. People had taught them to fail quietly. Later that afternoon, she requested Calvin's billing paperwork. The finance department informed her he charged less than half the rate of the consulting firms already dismissed. That bothered her more than she expected. Near evening, she stepped outside the facility and noticed something through the fence line. Calvin's old white van parked beneath a tree while Naomi slept across the passenger seat using her backpack as a pillow. Calvin himself sat on the curb nearby, eating vending machine crackers and reading through handwritten notes from the repair. No celebration, no dramatic exit, just work being completed. Veronica stood there several seconds before turning away again. The following week, news of the federal investigation remained mostly hidden from the public. Large corporations possessed powerful instincts for privacy. Still, changes began immediately inside Harlow. Independent infrastructure audits, mandatory manual inspections, replacement of several department heads. Veronica attended every review meeting personally. Employees noticed she listened differently now. More pauses, fewer interruptions. Meanwhile, Calvin returned to ordinary life. School drop-offs, repair calls, laundry. One Tuesday evening, Naomi sat at the kitchen counter finishing algebra homework while Calvin repaired a broken toaster somebody from church had dropped off. She looked up from her notebook. That lady at the factory thought you were poor. Calvin adjusted a loose wire. We are poor compared to her. That's not what she meant. He plugged the toaster in. The heating coils glowed orange. Then he finally answered. People see what helps them explain the world quickly. Naomi considered that. Do you? Sometimes. She returned to her homework quietly. A few days later, Renee Torres called during dinner. Several federal contracts had been temporarily frozen pending investigation. Your documentation helped more than you realize, she said. Calvin stirred soup on the stove. Machines leave records. Most people just stop reading after the first page. Torres laughed softly. You ever think about training investigators? No. Why not? Because broken systems already keep me busy. After hanging up, he carried bowls to the table. Naomi sniffed the soup. Too much pepper, probably. Still edible, barely. The ordinary rhythm returned slowly. That was the strange thing about enormous moments. They still had to fit inside regular Thursdays afterward. Bills still arrived. Shoes still wore out. The bathroom radiator still clanged every night at 11:20. One rainy afternoon, Calvin picked Naomi up from school and found her sitting silently in the passenger seat longer than usual. Finally, she asked, "You think Mom would have liked factories?" Calvin started the van. Your mother liked people who built useful things. That counts? Naomi nodded, then watched rain move sideways across the windshield. 2 weeks after the Harlow incident, somebody knocked on the duplex door just after sunset. Calvin opened it. Veronica Hale stood on the porch holding a covered aluminum tray. No security staff, no assistants, just a wool coat damp from rain. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then she lifted the tray slightly. Lasagna. Calvin looked at the tray. That seems unlikely. A faint breath escaped her nose. The grocery store made it. I cooked enough to justify pretending otherwise. Naomi appeared in the hallway behind him. That's the factory lady? Veronica glanced toward her. Hello, Naomi. How do you know my name? You wrote it on your drawings. Naomi stepped closer cautiously. Did your machines break again? No. Good. Calvin opened the screen door wider. You drove 2 hours for grocery store lasagna. Veronica looked past him into the modest kitchen with its repaired cabinets and humming radiator. I spent most of my life believing competence always announces itself properly. Calvin waited. She continued. Turns out some people just carry toolboxes. Silence settled between them. Not comfortable, not hostile either. Naomi solved it first. Do you want to come in or stand in the rain forever? Veronica actually smiled then, small, unpracticed. Inside, the duplex smelled like soup and soldered metal. Calvin cleared space at the table, while Veronica placed the tray down carefully. Naomi studied her openly. You really buy your lasagna? Usually. My dad burns cheese when he gets distracted. That sounds accurate. Calvin shook his head slightly while reaching for plates. Conversation moved awkwardly at first, then less awkwardly. Veronica asked about Naomi's science projects. Naomi asked why rich executives always wear uncomfortable shoes. Veronica removed one heel beneath the table and flexed her foot. Fair question. Eventually, the rain slowed outside. Veronica stood near the door, preparing to leave. Before opening it, she looked toward Calvin. I reviewed every maintenance protocol in that facility personally, and I kept thinking about what you said. Which part? You already decided before asking. Calvin rested one hand against the doorframe. Most people do. She nodded slowly, then glanced toward Naomi, brushing crumbs from the table. Good night, Naomi. Night. The door closed softly behind her. Weeks later, autumn settled fully across Ohio. Leaves gathered along curbs. Cold air crept through the duplex windows at night. One Saturday morning, Calvin stood in the kitchen repairing the loose cabinet hinge that had bothered Monica years earlier. The screws stripped twice before finally catching. Naomi sat nearby building a model bridge from popsicle sticks for school. You know what I think? Dangerous beginning. I think people are like machines. Calvin tightened the hinge carefully. How? If nobody checks the small problems, eventually everything starts shaking apart. He looked at her then, not surprised, only thoughtful. Maybe. She held up 2 bridge pieces. Can you hand me the glue? He did. Outside, a city bus sighed at the corner stop. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice. Ordinary sounds. The cabinet finally closed correctly for the first time in years. Calvin opened it once, closed it again. Smooth now, Naomi noticed. Mom would have liked that. He rested his hand briefly against the cabinet door. Yeah, probably. The sunlight through the kitchen window shifted across the worn floorboards, while the radiator knocked softly in the next room. Calvin stood there another moment beside the repaired hinge and the half-finished bridge, and the child growing steadily older at the table behind him. Then he reached for the next thing that needed fixing.